First of all, Kayla, thank you for inviting me, and thank you guys for being here, really. It was a beautiful day in New York. The sky, it was crystal blue, and there was just a little nip in the air. It was getting cooler just like now because fall was coming. And we have a reflection of what the day was like, but the sky was bluer. It was just, it was beautiful. I had plans to go into the city that day. I often went into Manhattan. Going to teach my morning classes, then get into Grand Central Station and into Manhattan in the afternoon. And obviously that didn't happen. I was in my classroom, and in every class on the wall they had a phone. And for the start of the lesson, the phone rang, and it was Pat, my husband. And he said, "Hon, I'm sorry I'm bothering you, but I wanted you to know there's been an accident in the city, that a plane flew into one of the towers of the World Trade Center." And what flashed through my mind was, I remember years before, a black and white newsreel of a plane that had flown into the Empire State Building. And I think it had happened in the 30s or the 40s. And I remember seeing pictures of that in black and white, and this must have been a documentary or something. And I just said, "Oh, where was it? A big plane? Was it a single engine?" And he said, "No, it was a jet passenger plane." And I just went cold. It didn't register. And I remember saying, he said to me, "Marilyn, say a little prayer." And I said, "I will." And I also promised him that I would call him during lunch. So I went back to the classroom, and I'm a very poor judge of time. But it was a little while later, and I glanced over to the door. I always left my door open to my classroom. And I saw a friend standing there, a fellow teacher, part of the faculty. And she was beckoning me over to her. And so I paused the class, and as I started, I looked at her face, and it was shocked, and it was ashen, and I thought, oh, she's just going to tell me about the accident. She doesn't know I already know. And I got to her, and she pulled me into the hallway, and she said, "Marilyn, it wasn't an accident. There's been another plane, and it's hit the South Tower." And I couldn't grasp that. I had 3 friends that worked in the South Tower, and I knew they went to work that day. It was a Tuesday. I knew that they were in their offices. And I don't remember really what I said to her, but I remember that a couple other teachers joined us, and we were trying to organize and decide what to do, because you've got to remember that we were close enough to the city that there were hundreds of people that would commute into the city every day. So in an impromptu decision, we decided we had to get every student whose parent could be working in the World Trade Center separated. We had an in-house psychiatrist. We'd bring them down to the office with them while this was happening. So I said a little prayer, and I took a deep breath, and I went back into my classroom. And I tried to keep it as generalized as I could. And I said, "Okay, guys, is there anyone of your parents that work in Lower Manhattan?" And hands went up. And so I said, "Okay, the rest of you turn to page 45, start doing the exercises, and when we get back, we'll start our exercises." and I led them into the hall. And I remember closing the door behind me and turning to them, and they were just staring at me. And I said, do any of your parents work in the World Trade Center? And thank God no one did. My friend Cammie, that many of you know about, I've talked about her. She taught across the hall. She had 4. In those days, there wasn't any cell phones. Kids didn't have cell phones. Students didn't. So I said to them, listen, there's been an incident at the World Trade Center. I want you to call your parents. I know they're in the city, and I know they want to talk to you. So go home and call them. Don't have to worry about class. You have a free ticket for homework for tomorrow. Just go home and call. And I went back into the classroom. I'm a poor judge of time, but it was very shortly after the classes were canceled. And all of us gathered in the faculty room where there was a television. And I remember us hugging each other, not the guys, they were standing off, but the gals we were. And I was holding another dear friend, Mary, and her husband was a fireman. And she said to me, Marilyn, Bob called me a few minutes ago, and he said that he and his entire crew were just going to get on the truck, the fire truck, and drive as quickly as they could into the city to help with rescue and recovery. And so we watched. And when the the tower collapsed, and I remember holding her so tight. Bob's body was recovered about a week and a half later. And we watched, and I was praying. I forced myself to focus on the South Tower because that's where my friends were. I knew exactly what floor they were on, where their offices were, and I knew they had to be afraid. They had to be so afraid because they had to have heard and seen and felt this tower crumbling next to them. And I knew they were afraid. And I gave a prayer for their strength, just to hang on, because I was so sure that the firemen would get there in time if they could just hang on and bring them down. And when the South Tower began collapsing, I knew they were falling. I knew they were falling. And in those few seconds, I said a prayer, and I said, they're falling. Please lift them up to you. Lift them up to you. And I know he did. In the days that followed, everybody gathered to help out as much as we could in a lot of communities. We gathered blankets and pillows and shaving kits and disposable washcloths and food, and everything was brought to the firemen, the rescuers, as long as we could. In those weeks, and even a couple months, nobody went into the city. But 3 months later, in December, around Christmas time, Pat and I decided we were going to go in. It was to celebrate our anniversary, to see a couple shows. And when we were in the hotel, Pat quietly turned to me and said, I think we should go down to ground zero. And I said to him, I don't think I can. And he said to me, we owe them this. Don't worry, I'm going to be right by your side. I'm going to hold your hand. And so we made our way down to Lower Manhattan. But you couldn't go far because the subways were destroyed. So we had to walk. And we got down as far as Battery Park. Battery Park is it's the lowest part of Manhattan where the World Trade Center is. And you could stand on that toward the water and see the Statue of Liberty, and it's very pretty down there. And I remember turning the corner and looking, and it wasn't there. It just wasn't there. And there was a group of people standing around, I don't know what to call it, the pit, standing around a lot of people. Once again, my estimate, I don't know, I would say about 100 people. And it was very close to St. Paul's Chapel. And in the pictures that you've seen, you may have known that St. Paul's Chapel was a stone edifice, a stone chapel, very small, that was built in the 1700s. And the firemen were using that for refuge. They would come there and they would sleep in the pews, and food would be brought to them. So we entered in that's right next to where the towers were. And we went into this crowd, and what you saw in photos was exactly that, only it was bigger. It was just big. And just what you saw, the steel girders that came up that were supports for the tower were in grotesque forms, and that huge American flag in the back. But what you couldn't see in the photos was that even after 3 months, there was smoke still coming from the rubble. And that's because underneath the World Trade Center was a complete complex of subways and bistros and shops and even a theater, and they were still burning. What struck me the most, standing in this crowd, was the silence. It was silent. And I know it was silent because I remember hearing babies crying distant in this crowd. And everyone was just stunned and in silence. And then in the silence next to me, Pat began to pray out loud. And the people around us bowed their heads. And when he finished, very slowly, he began to say the Lord's Prayer. And whatever you think about New Yorkers, I want you to remember that 100 New Yorkers paused and began praying aloud the Lord's Prayer. I've been back a few times to the Ground Zero world, and I have to say, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. They have done something so beautiful and given so much beauty to what was so ugly and was so horrible. The perimeters of the towers are huge. They're huge. Especially the North Tower was very close. And they made that into a reflection pool, a pool. It's gorgeous. And around the edging, the encasing was in granite. And all the names were engraved. And I was able to find my friends' names. It makes me believe that life and beauty can go on after tragedy. And despite all the tragedies in our life, even here in Kirby, losing our loved ones and losing our friends, that yes, there is the promise that life and beauty can exist after tragedy. And despite all of our losing of our loved ones and our friends, we haven't lost them. We're going to be joining them someday in a place that has so much beauty that we can't describe it. We can't even imagine how to describe it. So, for our loved ones, and for all our lost friends, I know that Leon is going to lead us in prayer.